What's up, people? I know that we usually do music on here all the time, and of course, that's really important, but I've had so many requests from the old days that I put out this information. So instead of just firing up another channel on a different platform, I'm just going to do it right here on YouTube. Now, listen, these are strictly informative. It's not legal advice in any way, shape, or form. And I want to preface this video by saying a few things first. Number one is if you want to challenge the government with respect to constitutional rights, you can absolutely do that, but you have to do it their way and on their terms. And if you sort of follow the procedure that they prescribe, you'll have a higher than average chance of being successful in getting them to grant you the remedy that you're requesting, type thing, meaning they'll do what you're asking them to do. Right. But if you don't follow it, or you follow some kooky, like formula, the sovereign citizen stuff, without understanding how to make a basic legal argument, you hear me talking about this in music all the time. You got to understand the simple stuff before you can actually start making more complex expressions. And the same is true, if you will, with respect to protecting your interests in society and your family's interests in society. Now that the society we live in has basically gone a little crazy, I think you can see what's going on in the UK right now, and what's happening in the United States. It's the people that are speaking out, the common sense individuals that are just like, I want to exist and be prosperous and provide a good life for my kids and everything like that. And you're basically the government, if you will, you're making my life difficult. So I just like to find a way to sort of minimize how much actual impact you can have with respect to what I'm doing. And surprisingly enough, or unsurprisingly enough, you have an incredible amount of power vested in you by way of the Constitution. And so we're going to start a new whole series here talking about you and the law and how it works and how the whole sort of like system plays out, and some basic truths that you can then start to formulate your own ideas. And if you decide later on that you want to take a swipe at the government, well, then so be it. Get her done. But make sure you prepare accordingly and understand if you make a mistake, it's high risk, high reward. So if you make serious mistakes and stuff like that, and you start making claims that you can't back up or your argument sucks, you could end up in jail. So it's not a game. I mean, it's a very, very high stakes game, but it's not something to be toyed with. So take the prerequisite amount of time to really sit down and think about what it is that you want to do, research the process, try to find as much information about how to engage in it as you can, and then, work your way up in small incremental steps like you would anything else. And then when you're ready, you can take on the big final boss. But until you get a lot of experience, and I would say that would take at least 5 years, because there's a lot of reading involved. This is boring stuff. It's not fun. Watching lawyers talk about different concepts and all the rest of that stuff, it's not exactly what I would call riveting entertainment. But if you want to protect your interests and you want to be able to survive effectively in the new sort of like quasi-technocratic, fascistic form of governance, if you will, that we're starting to create, this is going to be obviously an essential step. So without further ado, let's get into a bit of the history. Then we'll talk a bit about liberty and the legal personality. All right, let's get going on this. Essentially, I'm going to blister through a little bit of a history lesson here. Look, in the old days, you had kings and popes, right? Like the religious hierarchy that controlled the population when the church was powerful, and before that you had kings, and even at the same time you had kings and other powerful interests that ruled over the peasants, in this case with respect to the kings, and the congregation, which again was the peasants in the case of the popes. So you had a small group of people basically controlling a much larger group of people, and you could see that there was a certain sort of recognition, if you will, of the fact that you don't bite the hand that feeds, because the sort of religious institutions would give the peasants 150 days of holidays every single year. Let that sink in. They'd work for like fractions of what you're working. Oh my God, who wouldn't trade that? Oh, you 150 days and then have the rest of the year off. You mean I get 200 days off? Okay, that's awesome. I'm done. I'll absolutely do that, right? So, I mean, that's the thing is you got to sort of understand that there's some unspoken rules that the people at the top of the food chain understand, that there's a lot more people at the bottom of the food chain. And so when you get a dynamic like that, they usually what they do is in a sneaky way, they create a mechanism, if you will, that outs these peasants, the individual, if you will, from the control mechanisms they create for the betterment of society, or that's what they claim. That's what they claim, but it's just basically how to soak society, if you will, for their benefit, meaning extract resources, money, or real estate, or exerting control. Who knows what kind of weird proclivities these people have, but it is what it is, right? So essentially what happened is after the kings and all the rest of that stuff gave more power to the peasants were like, our life is pretty good, so they started to procreate more and more. And eventually, of course, these people started to realize that there were way more peasants than they were them. Millions of these people and just a couple thousand of these ones with their knights and everything else, right? So they needed to come up with control mechanisms for society that applied to this whole group of persons. And they used a myriad of different ways. In the church's instance, they basically did, burn in hell and all the rest of that stuff. And this one, it's off with your head. So one's just direct, brutal violence, and the other one is like the threat of eternal damnation. And you can see the same functions like working in both of these sort of spheres where they effectively, they're interchangeable, right? A pope is nothing more than a religious king. So, done. Anyways, over the thousands of years, finally the Romans basically developed these maxims of law, which is them distilling all the early stuff. And of course, it came even after when these people were basically in the ecclesiastical rule. But my point being here is that they started to actually group these things like buyer beware is a Roman maxim of law, okay, from thousands of years ago to make as the basis for laws. But like I said, when you're dealing with a group of people that number in the millions and you're just a couple thousands, what they had to do is essentially put a safety valve in there for themselves, per se, because once the peasants got riled up, they would start burning down the property and destroying stuff and getting all kinds of nasty, right? So to make it look like they had more control, they gave them the Magna Carta, but really, in my opinion, the Magna Carta basically gave the kings and the popes, most of the control back, okay? But then gave the people the illusion that they had a certain measure of freedom, right? Okay, fine, you agree to our rules and stuff like that, but then, of course, they were just continue to be brutalized afterwards. So, and it's true, even to this day, we have constitutionally protected rights that can never be taken away from you, and they're constantly violated on a regular basis. But this one document, if you will, was the beginning of essentially the birth of human rights, right? And then after the Great Wars, when we did all kinds of evil and awful things, it became very clear that they needed to sort of like combine a bunch of documents like the Nuremberg Code and the Prague Declaration, and there's a whole bunch of other ones in there, into a couple international instruments that followed some rules that they basically came up with in the Vienna Treaty. And essentially those things became like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and stuff like that. And then eventually about the 70s, these human rights, if you will, that were essentially started to be developed back in whatever, the 1100s, finally became part of constitutional law, which is the law system that we use in North America and Europe and all kinds of other places that have a constitution that recognized that we had rights that basically stem from this document, but are more defined now because you know how humans are. We keep like elaborating on stuff. We have rights and stuff like that that existed long before, you know, the construction of the constitutional law that grants the governments of modern day to create two systems of law, common law and statutory law. Common law is now known as human rights law, and statutory law is the stuff that you see when you're like, oh, you were doing 60 in a 50 zone. That's statutory law. Okay, there's no real crime being committed. It's just that somebody's making a claim that there's a rule that you have to drive 50 miles an hour in this area, and you're like, nah, I don't want to because there's nobody here and I want to get home, and so you're doing 60. It's not like you're not in control of the vehicle or anything like that, or driving recklessly, and then just some random person shows up and starts exercising arbitrary authority over you by claiming that it's because some other people wrote laws down on a piece of paper that you have to follow them. Okay, so there's that kind of thought process with the law, and then there's what they call human rights law, which means that you have certain rights like liberty and security of the person and the right to life, you know, that are basically intrinsic to you. They're inherent to you. They can never be removed. You always have them, right? And two of them is liberty, okay, and the legal personality. And we're going to talk about that in this video. We're going to look at a couple basic examples. But that is essentially a very, very, very crude rundown. We had systems of ultimate control, okay, that started to be codified. You lived and died under the rule of the Roman emperors, right? And then eventually we get to a point where there's more of these people than these people can actually realistically handle. And these people get upset and they start basically being like, okay, you're next. And so what these people did was come up with an ingenious idea, which is give them rights to be like, okay, just go back to the fields and grow the potatoes and whatever it is, right? Or the wheat, and collect the olives or whatever it was. And just, you know, don't hurt us, even though we were evil to you, right? And that went on for quite some time. And of course, you saw the whole thing fall apart essentially in the Great Wars. And that's when the world for 6 seconds, I guess you could say, in the big picture, started to have a bit of a conscience and be like, look, there are rights involved with stuff like your right to not be experimented on in a, you know, some sort of crude fashion, or the right to be, you know, without torture or whatever else it is, psychological or physical or whatever it was, or the right to not be put into slavery or servitude, right? These basic sort of like human rights that are so deeply ingrained in people because they would infringe on their freedom and their liberty. Those things became available through constitutional law, and we'll look at how that happened. And then, of course, there's the understanding of the natural human rights stuff and the statutory law stuff, where they're two different things, and it's a choice. Will you participate over here, or will you stay over here on this side and basically deny any authority granted under this particular law? And then if they keep pushing it, you can go to court and you can be like, they're violating my human rights, and so I want you to invalidate it, and they will. And that starts with the idea here of liberty and the idea that you possess legal personality. Right, that's the end of that. Let's get into this next section. All right, now listen, I'm just going to blister right through this stuff, but if you go to the U.S. Constitution, you look at the 9th Amendment, it says, the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people, meaning you have other rights that cannot be denied and they can't be disparaged by the state by way of the Constitution. Okay, the Constitution grants you the right to not have these other rights that are not enumerated in the Constitution, meaning it's not one of the amendments. You have other rights that exist outside of the Constitution, and the 9th Amendment grants you the power to essentially exercise them. Okay? In Canada, we have it here under Section 26. It says, guaranteed in this charter of certain rights and freedoms shall not be construed as denying the existence of any other rights or freedoms that exist in Canada. Okay, so this is basically saying the same thing as this one. And then you can see that essentially being made true here in this document, which is the U.S. Reservation on the Declaration and Understandings International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Now, listen, this is just basically them saying we recognize this international document, okay, that those international instruments that came through constitutional law, there's the constitutional amendment that grants you access to this right, to the rights. Whoops, sorry, I should go all the way up here to the International Covenants on Civil and Political Rights. And you can see the government in 1992 made a declaration being like, yeah, we do recognize and consent to all of the things in there. Now, look at the most important stuff is Articles 1 through 27 of the covenant are not self-executing, meaning you have the right of free speech, right, for the most part. And you can exercise that whenever you want. But if you want to exercise the rights in this bad boy here, which are a lot more powerful in a lot of ways, then, you have to find a way to make them self-executing, okay? Because as it is right now, until you do something, you can't really access them in a court of law. And we're going to talk about that later, of course. And I want to point out to this one here too, that Article 47, they make special reference to it, and they're like, you can exercise the right expressed in Article 47, but only in accordance with international law. And we'll look at Article 47, and I think you'll be like, wow, the taxes thing, I didn't see that coming. Of course, in Canada, we have another judgment here, essentially from the Supreme Court of Canada, that says, as a treaty to which Canada is a signatory, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights is binding. Okay, and that was from 2013, from the DeVito one against the Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness and blah, blah, blah. Okay, so this is an important sort of judgment that sort of laid the groundwork to be like, Canada signed on to the treaties in 1976, and they became actionable in law under the Constitution Act 1982 by way of Section 26 here. And you can see the rights themselves actually mirrored. Like, for example, Section 7, which we're going to look at, it says everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of the person. And if I go to the international covenants and I go down to Article 9 here, you can see everyone has the right to liberty and security of the person. Done. Okay, so everything in the Constitution and whatnot, in ours, because we rewrote it, if you will, in 1982, is very closely related to this one here. But you can see the same operations in law with the Ninth Amendment and countless other things in the United States. But you're going to have to dig a little bit more, and I'm going to be talking more specifically about Canada and stuff like that because I know it better. But all of the rules I'm about to talk about are true there. And in this case, I think you're talking about the 14th Amendment when you're talking about the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and all that good stuff, whatever it is, right? So you'll have to track them down for yourself, and that's part of it. Get more serious and sort of interested in this stuff than what I'm teaching in this video, if you will, and then basically use that as the fuel to sort of like get interested to figure this stuff out. But there it is. You have extra rights that are covered under the Constitution, if you will, and then the government has filed documents that recognize these rights, and they make a few stipulations. So if you're in America, you're gonna have to read through this, but once you do, you're like, oh, okay, so I have to claim my rights, right? And it's the same thing here in Canada. I'm not going to go there, but if you go to the Criminal Code of Canada and you look at Section 35 under the defense of property rights, you'll see that you need to file a claim of right, which is the exact same thing you need to do here, is file a claim of right where you claim your rights under the international covenants. Now, listen, after the Great Wars and everything, we had the Nuremberg Code, we had the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and all of that stuff basically got rolled up into the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Social, Economic, and Cultural Rights. Now, listen, Canada, we have both. You guys down in the States only have this one, as you just saw. It's the only one that's recognized there. Now, I understand why they did that, because there's some real juicy rights in the other one. But the point being here is you can quickly see that this is breaking society into several pieces, right? You can see like weird things, the human family here, right? But down here, they're like the human person. Well, that's kind of weird. And then they're talking about free human beings here. And then they're talking about the individual. So you see all these characters in law. Read through the preamble and stuff like that. I'm guarantee you this paragraph right here and this one right here will be an eye-opener, right? In this case, you're like, okay, so I have human rights that are basically designed to make me live carefree in the world, and the government's essentially supposed to be looking after my interests. But down here, they're like, yeah, but at the same time, you have duties and responsibilities and obligations to society. And so they create essentially a bifurcated society where there's like a hidden world, the human rights world, and all they really promote is the you sort of like your societal duties, you know, get a job and pay your taxes and all the rest of that stuff, even though none of those things are actually a requirement of the human being, because it's morally wrong. If you work your butt off at a job and then I just automatically show up and I'm anybody but the government and I stick my hand out, I'm like, can I get half your paycheck? You're going to laugh in my face. Well, why is the government allowed to do it? It's the exact same. It's the exact same principle, right? And we'll look at it a little later on, but it's just something you need to understand, right? So listen, a couple important articles right off the bat here is number one, you have the right to self-determination, right? To determine your political status and pursue economic, social, and cultural development. That's your choice, how you interact in society, right? Number 1.2 here, which is all peoples may for their own ends freely dispose of all of their natural wealth and resources without prejudice or obligation arising out of international economic cooperation based on the principle of mutual benefit and international law, okay? No one can be deprived of their own means of subsistence. That's a big one with respect to the government asking for a bunch of money that they're not entitled to. But they're granted that right under Article 2, and I'm going to go over this stuff later on because I don't want to get too deep into it. Okay, they're granted the power because all individuals within the territory owned by the state party here are subject to its jurisdiction. And then all of a sudden they throw in some flowery stuff to be like, oh, well, you can't discriminate based on a whole bunch of criteria here. It's pretty funny, right? So that's a huge one. Going down here to 4, it's important to understand that certain rights like 6, 7, 8, 11, 15, 16, and 18 are not subject to limitation ever, even in a public emergency or times of war or anything else. These rights can never be taken away from you. And look at some of them. 6, the inherent right to life. 7, free from cruel and unusual punishment or degrading treatment. You can't be scientifically or medically experimented on. That would be a big one for COVID-19 and bird flu right there. 8, you can't be held in servitude. You can't be made a slave. Go down to 11, right? You can't be imprisoned because you can't fulfill a contractual obligation. That's for child support right there, right? Moving down to the big one here, 16, which is everyone has the right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law, right? And of course, down to the bottom here, you have the right to freedom of thought and conscience and whatnot. Now, this one does come with restriction, but the restriction is only upon manifesting your religion, not the right to actually think about it or congregate with other people. It's just to manifest the religion, okay? Everything else is outside of this restriction. So, it is what it is kind of thing. But up here at 9, you can see everyone has the right to liberty. Okay, now most people think this word liberty means that you have the freedom of movement. You can move around. You're not going to be incarcerated and all this good stuff. And it's true. You can't be deprived of your liberty except on such grounds and in accordance with such procedures as established by law, right? Meaning basically they have to have laws in place. But the fact of the matter is they can restrict certain liberties, okay? And those liberties are usually freedoms and privileges granted to statutory creatures. But human beings have liberty that is not predicated on any sort of like privilege, if you will. And you can get that sort of impression here and really understand the power of this word in this right here, the right to liberty, when you actually look it up in a dictionary. Now, in 1960-ish, there was the Vienna Treaty. And when they wrote that was at the beginning. They're like, listen, this was ratified in 66, right? So, and this happened in 1960. So I think you can see where they're going. They're like, listen, we have to establish some rules for when we write these documents so everybody knows what we're talking about. And they said that any words that you find in here the definition should be looked up in a regular dictionary. In this case, the Merriam-Webster, I believe, is the one that they want. So I've already gone ahead and did liberty. And look what it says, the quality or state of being free, the power to do as one pleases, do what you will, the freedom to be, from physical restraint. Nobody can sort of restrain you for doing what you want. You can't interfere with me physically when I want to be free and do as I please. The freedom from arbitrary or despotic control Arbitrary. Notice that one in there. They didn't just say despotic control, they said arbitrary control. And we will look at this word arbitrary a little bit deeper in another video because it's a really important one. This is the nexus of all statutory law. Arbitrary control. Those control mechanisms, the Roman maxims of law, basically used to control society. But here's the thing. If you have the right to liberty, you have the right to do as you please. And you'll see that later on down here, that this arbitrary control can be limited. And they even admit it down here, of course. Another big one, the positive enjoyment of various social, political, or economic rights and privileges. A huge one, the power of choice. And you just saw that here with the covenant. When I go back up to section 1, it's the first one. All people have the right of self-determination. That's the power of choice. That's how powerful liberty is. You choose. You don't have to listen to what anybody else says. If you're like, look, okay, there's a pandemic going on, fair enough, that's your opinion. Good luck. But they can't force you to do anything, and that's when you can basically start invoking your right to be like, okay, well, under Article 7 here, you can't experiment on me, and since you have no real-world data to substantiate your claims, just computer models, I respectfully decline because I have the right of self-determination, right? And here's the thing, that right of self-determination and the right of liberty allows me to exercise my recognition down here. Whoops. Under Article 16, to be recognized as an individual rather than whatever it is that the legal infrastructure wants me to be called so that they can exercise some sort of control over me. Again, you see that here, a right or immunity enjoyed by prescription, meaning it's given to you by the government, which means it can be taken away, or by grant. Now that's from the Constitution. It means immunity from state power that you can enjoy whenever you want, granted to you by the Constitution because of, that's right, the Ninth Amendment. The International Covenant invalidates and limits the amount of statutory control the state can exercise upon you. And that's basically what they're talking about here. In this case, the immunity enjoyed or the right enjoyed is given to you by the government. That's like the benefits of citizenship, if there are any, right? So, I mean, you can see the big difference here. Absolutely. Permission, especially to go freely within specified limits. Right? So, specified limits. That's weird. Weird that there's this sort of terminology to be like there's boundaries. There are boundaries that you are free to go around, like it was given liberty of the house. Well, in this case, the liberty we're talking about applies to the entire country. So within the entire country, and that's way down here, I think at Article 50. Let's see if I'm right. Yep. The provisions of the covenant shall extend to all parts of federal states without any limitations or exceptions. Okay, that's like saying liberty applies. You don't take your liberties within the house, enjoy yourself as you see fit. That's what they're saying there. You have permission to go about freely within the specified limits, in this case, the entirety of the country. There is no sort of defining border. So that's that. An action beyond normal limits. Okay, so you now have the power to go beyond what is prescribed as being, this is the limitation, right? Like a breach of etiquette or propriety. Well, that's, you're not allowed to say that mean stuff. You're not allowed to hold that sign up that says, F the police. Of course you do, because you have liberty. You have the right to do as you please. And these people can't physically restrain you with arbitrary control mechanisms because you have the enjoyment of a whole bunch of political and economic and, I guess you could say human rights. That's not in here. Notice that. That's sneaky. But you know what I mean? And the power of choice, which means you don't, whatever power that this person was about to be like, okay, we're going to arrest you for a breach of the peace. That's aimed at a person that can be either the individual or some other corporate entity, like whatever, if you're talking about a rental agreement, it's the landlord and the tenant. If you're talking about a person in a car, it's the driver. If you're talking about a person that likes hunting and fishing, it's the hunter, it's the fisherman, or whatever that designation is. If it's a person paying taxes, it's the taxpayer or the resident. There's all these little words, the weasel words that they go in there. That doesn't say your name. It doesn't say you exactly. It says you're going to be this person. I'm going to show you that in law later on. You're going to see that basic function that you're signing a contract with the state to be like, I accept all of the rules and responsibilities you're about to lay at my feet and give up my liberty. That's what they're really saying. Give up your liberty, give up your full legal capacity so that you can now have, boundaries set upon you with specified limits that we can now charge you because there's a breach of etiquette or propriety. See that? With liberty, you can go beyond those limits and you can't be limited. But as soon as you enter into a situation of arbitrary control where they have power over the statutory creature, your legal personality, well, now that's a different story, right? Look at down here, a violation of rules or a deviation from standard practices, right? So, of course, you have the liberty to do you want. You can even see it here. He took the liberty in the way he played the game, meaning he played the game, outside the conventional norms or whatever it is, and whatever, he was successful, he was unsuccessful. But the point being here is he had the power of choice to be like, I don't want to do it your way. I don't want to play this game your way. I want to do it on my own terms. And this idea of liberty gave him that ability to do that, right? And again, a distortion of the facts. Well, you can't control a person because they have the power of choice. So they can lie anytime they want or make up whatever story they want. The only one that's not really pertinent is this one down here because it's specific to the Navy. And it's just the way that they use this word to describe this specific action of taking leave for 48 hours or less. Okay, so that's not really have anything to do with the main one here, but that's why liberty is so important, because you have this right. Now, listen, we're already down here. Check out 47. Nothing in the present covenant shall be interpreted as impairing the inherent right, meaning a right that can never be removed from you, of all peoples, including the individual, to enjoy and utilize fully and freely their natural wealth and resources. What do you think that means? And then, of course, if you go over here to this one here, it says you can only exercise Article 47 in accordance with international law. But the United States declares that the right is actionable. That means that you no longer have to pay taxes. That's what that means. Because you can make a credible argument by going all the way to the top here and invoking Article 1.2 and being like, you've already said that I don't have to dispose of any of my natural wealth and resources where I'm prejudiced to give money for the principle of mutual benefit. Okay? So this is an incredibly important and powerful tool, and that basically demonstrates the resident or the taxpayer is responsible for taxes, not you. And I actually have a court judgment that we'll look at later on from 1948 in Canada where they're like, residents pay taxes, not Canadians, and they basically reveal the scam. But this concept of liberty here, of doing what you will and sort of being free of the arbitrary control, this effectively lays bare the entire scam that was essentially created way back in the day when they started to do these control mechanisms for the control of society. Back in those days, you couldn't get out of it. The peasants had no chance to basically be like, I don't want to follow your dopey rules or the Pope's rules or whatever it is. And the congregation was like, yeah, no, we're out. That didn't come until way, 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 way later. Way like 400 years or 500 years after the Magna Carta, right? So once that did happen, though, essentially, and the ball started to get rolling, then you had the international covenants kick in, which is the supreme document which basically lays out the entirety of how our modern society works. And a lot of these articles and stuff like that are very, very powerful. Again, Article 4, very important with its no derogation clause. Article 5, with respect to limitations on the rights, either expressed in the covenant or limited to a greater extent than what is provided for. Huge, right? You're talking about the inherent right to life. You're talking about not being subjected to cruel and unusual punishment or scientific or medical experimentation. You're talking about freedom from slavery, freedom from servitude. Go look up what the word servitude means and then be like, oh, okay, that's not so good, right? The right to liberty and the security of the person. See what those mean. What does that right mean? And here's the thing, and I'll leave it at this. Essentially, once you start scrolling down and whatnot, you'll get to some clauses here. And you'll start to see that there are limitations. See, like everyone has the right to the freedom. Notice it's not a right that goes directly. It's the right to freedom to do something of association in this case. But if you keep going down here, you can see that they can limit it for a whole bunch of reasons like public safety or public order, the protection of public health. I think you're starting to get an idea there with COVID-19. And of course, for the protection of morals and stuff like that. And these things here, the freedom of association, I'll use Canada for an example here. If I go to the very top here and you look at it, there's the freedom of association right there. And all Section 2 rights here, all of these ones, freedom of association, freedom to peaceably assemble, freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression, and freedom of conscience and religion, they can all be limited by Section 1, okay? And that's why people who basically take their matter before court here under this section are going to lose and lose brutally. But Section 7 here, life, liberty, and the security of the person, and we'll look at this judgment, can never be limited. There will never be a limitation applied to this because you can't. You cannot deprive the person, if you will, of liberty. There's no legal function that would allow the state party to do that, which is why it's one of the most powerful tools you have. And you see the fact that it's here, it's in the International Covenant, it's in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and so you can go for a very long way, plus an absolute mountain of jurisprudence that would actually prove that liberty is the single most greatest right you have, right? And essentially the nexus by which all other rights happen. Now, with respect to legal personality, I was going to do it, but we'll do it in the next video instead. We'll talk about how the legal person is created and how it's your property. That's yours. Like, imagine it's like your bank card, but instead of a bank card that takes money out of the bank, it's a card that lets you access the legal system. So make sure that you can seek a remedy, and you can see that right here under Article 2, Section 3, right? Where you can go and have a court of competent jurisdiction make a judgment based around any infringement of the rights. And there's another, obviously, international document we're going to look at that goes with the covenant, but we'll do that afterwards, that also says the exact same thing, but in more detail. It's about how to exercise your rights and stuff like that. So you have the power to go to a court, like a federal court and stuff like that, which will exercise inherent jurisdiction and basically petition that court to be like, they're violating my rights. And they can't do that under Article 4. And I'm citing this declaration here where they recognize that these rights exist. And I've already put in place Articles 1 through 27, although some of them, obviously, you don't need to. You're only going to select the articles here that deal where you don't have a limitation of the rights, right? Like the inherent right to life. Nobody can take that away from you, obviously. So you're going to be claiming this one. And again, the right to liberty and stuff like that. And then you can challenge these claims they make based on the established law, which of course there's almost no law that would grant the deprivation of liberty to the individual. You can deprive the statutory creature, the legal person, of liberty, but you cannot deprive a human being of their liberty, because liberty is the power of choice in how you interact in society. And that right there is obviously the very basis of the rule of law. If you can't do that, then people would just immediately rebel, because you'd be forced into a situation where you're a slave or you're an indentured servant, which most people are. There it is. What do you think citizenship is? It's indentured servitude. Because once you start recognizing the citizenship stuff, then all of a sudden you have to pay taxes. What do you think the 14th and I think the 16th is also part of it, with income tax and all the rest of that stuff in the States? So that's where it comes from. In our case, it comes from the Constitution Act 1867, which is basically our 14th Amendment, if you will. But yeah. The same principles of law exist in every single one, and the objective here is to these kings and queens and the popes and all the rest of that stuff. They want to go back to the days when you were a slave in servitude, but they want to do it so that you don't even know it. So they keep all of these rights secret from you, and they don't actually tell you that you have access to them, to make sure that you keep being a good little wage slave and staying under control and never exercising any of your liberty. And once you start to exercise that, or start to exercise the liberty, obviously, you can free yourself from the constraints that are also in the Constitution, which in essence is this Article 2 here, where they have the power to create laws and subject you to the jurisdiction, which is pay income taxes and all of these countless millions of other laws that are basically regulating every aspect of your life, which is ridiculous silliness. So I think we'll just end it there today. The thing to take away from in this video is liberty. Start looking that up. What does that mean? Look, start doing searches where you're like 9th Amendment plus right to liberty, and see what the United States or whatever it is, the right to liberty plus United States, however you want to sort of start your search engine sort of, search out. Yeah, I used it twice, but you know what I mean? Like that, this is going to put you on the path so that you get real understanding. But I've shown you the initial steps that the 9th Amendment recognizes rights that are enumerated in the International Covenants on Civil and Political Rights by way of this declaration. Okay. I mean, you don't need the declaration either. The 9th Amendment already gives it to you explicitly, but now it's covered by way of this declaration to be like, you've already said that you recognize all these rights and you'll abide by them, right? And of course, then you can start to apply the basic terminology with respect to liberty. Never, ever read one of these documents and think that the word that you're reading means what it is. I mean, literally go through each section and painstakingly deconstruct it, and you'll be much farther ahead of the game. You could read this one paragraph here for 20 minutes and try to really wrap your brain around it and start to see what they're really trying to talk about. You could even take this, copy it into Google or something like that, or a search engine, or maybe even one of the AI situations, and ask a question, be like, what do they mean by this paragraph? And get the AI to basically start looking into coming up with answers for you and whatnot, which would be an incredibly useful tool, including basically copying, pasting in these articles or whatnot, or just being like Article 1 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the right to determine what. And it'll search the internet through thousands and thousands of documents and basically give you a nice synopsis that you can take and then again use as a leaping off point to sort of get more knowledge. So the idea and understanding of liberty is going to be central for you to make any kind of credible legal argument to extricate yourself, because you have the immediate right to be free. You have the right to do as you please. No one can stop you from doing that as long as you're following the basic rules of society. They can't use arbitrary control, or in this case, despotic control, to inhibit this whatever it is that you're doing, you know what I mean? And that you have the positive enjoyment of these rights under a whole various number of different categories and stuff like that. And you can choose at any point in time to exercise those rights when you want to, including the right to be recognized either as an individual in their full legal capacity, which has, ultimate power, if you will, comparably to a statutory creature, where obviously if you enter into recognition as a driver, you know how many laws basically govern every aspect of driving. And the police just show up and start harassing you for the smallest little things. So That's where the liberty part comes in. You'd be like, well, do I have to be the driver? Right? I have a driver's license, yes, but in this case, do I have to be the driver? And watch their face then. All right. But that's the long and short of it. So I'm going to stop it right there. I appreciate every single one of you. I know this video is not going to be for everyone, but I really want to get this stuff out here. If there's any questions and stuff, of course, just smash them down into the comments and stuff like that. And of course, just start getting interested in it. This is, of course, an open-ended conversation. Let's all try to learn something about our system of governance and how rights work. And then once we do that, we can probably create a much better society where we don't have to get into a situation where it gets real testy. Like, you know, we can just start to use the weapons that have been used against us, against our enemies, and use the tools that we've been given in better times, if you will, to basically just completely shut them down. And once we do that, shut them down on their own turf, right? Go to court and just make them eat fists by exercising your liberty, then the tyranny ends permanently, because we can just start teaching everyone else to be like, liberty, a lot more important than you think it is, right? Plus, you can start to read between the lines of what these statements about what liberty is, you know, and notice that, look at how many actual definitions there are of what it means and its principle in law, which of course you're always just going to make a common sense argument about the plain meaning of what this is. And so you can do what I did, which is string it all along to basically make a pretty eloquent argument about going beyond the normal limits or prescribed limits or specified limits, right? And we can breach etiquette and propriety because we have liberty. We don't have to follow standard practices. We don't have to listen to your rules and regulations. I'm a grown person, can make my own decisions. I'm not hurting anybody. I'm not being reckless, right? Obviously, you have to have a measure of sort of being a reasonable human being. You can't just do whatever you want. But I don't think I'm trying to make the argument that you are. What I'm saying is we just want to be free from the government tyranny that is clearly basically breathing down our neck. So that's the end of tutorial number 1, the importance and power of liberty. See you in the next one.